Hey guys, it's Miss Keenum, and we are going to talk about adding and subtracting fractions today. This is part one of more than likely a four-part video series. So before we get started, let's just talk about what a fraction is. Remember, fractions are parts of a whole. It is the pieces that make up a whole pizza or a whole cake or a whole pan of brownies or whatever we're looking at. Fractions are the pieces that make up a whole. So when we add fractions, we join parts of a whole. We put the parts together. Just like when we add whole numbers, we add fractions. So here's a quick review of how we add whole numbers. So for the problem 1 plus 1 equals 2, we take our 1 and our 1, and that equals 2. So see how we added this chunk and this chunk to get two chunks. So these are already whole numbers, but we're still joining parts. We do the same thing when we add fractions. So in fraction addition, if I had the problem 1/4 plus 1/4 equals 2/4, how would I add that? So I would say 1/4. Remember, when I have a fourth, my whole is divided into four parts. 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's my 1/4. And then if I add a fourth, remember I have the same whole divided into four parts. I add one more. And when I put those two parts together in my whole, I get 2/4. Now, one important thing to remember when we're adding fractions is that we must always have the same denominator. This number, and this number are always the same when we're adding fractions. Keep that in mind. We could not have added 1/4 plus 1/3. There's more math to do to be able to add that, but today we're strictly focusing on fractions that have the same denominator. We can also add fractions using a number line. So in whole number addition with my number line, I would start at 0, and I would have 1, and then I would add one more, and I would end up at 2. In my fraction addition, the same thing, 1/4 plus 1/4 equals 2/4. Start at 0, I add a fourth, add another fourth, and I end up at 2/4. And remember, 2/4 is really the same thing as 1/2. Just a little side note there. Okay, so that was adding subtraction. So now let's talk about subtracting fractions. So when we subtract fractions, we separate parts of a whole. And we do the same thing in whole number subtraction. So in the problem, 2 minus 1 equals 1. I have two boxes. We could say that's my whole. And then I subtract 1. So I take one box away. I separate one box from the original whole of 2, and I wind up with one box remaining. So we are going to do the exact same thing when we subtract fractions. So in the problem, 2/3 minus 1/3 equals 1/3. We're going to start out with 2/3. Notice, once again, all my denominators are the same. So we can only add and subtract with like denominators. So remember, my denominator tells me how many parts are in my whole. So I have a box, and I've split it into 3 sections. 2/3, I'm going to color in 2 of those sections. That represents 2/3. Now I'm going to subtract 1/3. So when I subtract 1/3, I take one of those parts away. I separate that part, and I wind up with 1/3. So notice, when we add and subtract whole numbers and fractions, we're following the same process. And the key point when we are adding and subtracting fractions is that we always have the same denominator. We cannot add and subtract fractions unless the number on bottom is the same. Okay, once again, we can do the same thing with the number line. So 2 minus 1, we start out at 2 this time because we're subtracting. We hop 1 over to the left, to subtract 1, and we wind up with 1. Same thing with fractions, 2/3 minus 1/3. We're starting at 2/3 this time because we're subtracting. We jump over 1/3 because we're subtracting again, and we wind up with 1/3. So you can, to help you visualize how to add and subtract fractions, you can either draw pictures or you could use a number line or whatever way that helps you figure out how to do it. You can use that method. Okay, so let's get some more practice in. So 1/5 plus 3/5. What do we notice to begin with? Can we even add these fractions together? Yes, we can, because they have the same denominator or the same bottom number. Because of that, we can add these together. So I'm going to start off, and remember, my fractions make up a whole, and my denominator tells me how many parts are in the whole. So I have a box that I've broken down into 5 sections. 1, 5. Okay, so 1/5 is represented with one of those being colored in. Then I'm going to add 3/5. So I've got the same box, and I'm going to add 3/5. And then when I put those together, I wind up with 4/5. So see what I've done? I've added my top numbers to get 4. So I added my 1/5 to my 3/5. I also could have looked at this, instead of drawing it like I have it up here, if I didn't want to do that, I could have come in and I could have colored in 3 more boxes. See how that gives me a total of 4 colored in boxes, which gives me my number of 4/5, and that's my answer down here. Okay, let's move on. So this is a mixed fraction. So I have 1 1/5 plus 2 3/5. So I'm adding whole numbers and fractions in this problem. So my 1 1/5 is represented by one whole box, plus remember I have the same denominator, that's important. The 5 tells me my box is going to be split into 5s, or into fifths as we would say. So I have 1 1/5 shown here, plus 2 boxes and 3/5 shown here. And then when I add those together, I add my whole numbers first, which is going to give me 3 boxes, and then I add my fraction. This is the same fraction we just had. So I add the 1/5 and the 3/5. So 1 part of my square plus 3 parts of my square together, and I get 4 parts of the square to give me a total of 3 4/5. So see, I have 1, 2, 3, and then I have 1/5, and that's how I get my answer of 3 4/5. Okay, let's move on. So this time I'm going to subtract, and instead of breaking this down and subtracting the fraction and then the mixed numbers, we're going to subtract the mixed numbers at one time, which gets our whole numbers and our fractions. So my question asks, 2 3/5 minus 1 1/5 equals what? Remember, the first thing I have to do is make sure that my denominator is the same number, and in this case it is. They're both 5s, so I can indeed subtract these numbers. So I start off with 2 3/5. So see, I have 1 box and 2 boxes, and then I have 1, 2, and 3 here. So this shows me my fifths. That's how I show 2 3/5. Okay, now I've got to subtract 1 1/5. So to do that, I'm going to take out one of my big boxes, one of my whole numbers. So I subtract my whole numbers first, like I normally would, and then I have to subtract my fraction of 1/5. So when I do that, I take out one of the colored in boxes of my fraction. One part of my fraction I'm separating from the others. So that leaves me remaining with 1 2/5. So now, instead of that being a 2/5 and a 3/5, we can look at this as 1/5 and 2/5 that are remaining and colored in. I hope this video helped you learn how to add and subtract fractions and how you can compare that to joining and separating parts of a whole.